This message is a presentation of Pinnacle Baptist Church and the preaching ministry of Pastor Ray McBerry. Other messages like this are available online at pinnaclebaptist.com. The church is located at 2517 High Falls Road in Griffin, Georgia. If you're in the area, we would love for you to visit us this Sunday. Now, here's today's message.
Well, tonight we're back in the book of 2 Corinthians, and we're going to be in chapter number 9 tonight, but I'll go ahead and tell you, chapter number 9 is a rather short chapter, and so the pastor has a somewhat ambitious goal of trying to get us through chapters 9 and 10 tonight, if the Lord allows us to, but we won't rush through chapter 9. We'll see how we go and what kind of progress we make. But in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, we saw that the Apostle Paul was dealing with the subject of Christian giving, particularly the giving of the churches up in Macedonia to help, to help the saints that were back in Jerusalem, because there was a famine and they were being persecuted. So the churches north of Corinth, up in Macedonia, the northern part of Greece, they had taken up collections to be sent to help the church in Jerusalem. And Paul had asked the church at Corinth to participate in that, to do the same. And so we saw part of that in chapter number 8, where they had said a year prior to that they wanted to participate also, but they had not yet given towards this offering. And so Paul says, I hope that you'll go ahead and get your offering together. And so that kind of sets the stage for chapter number 9, because chapter number 9, remember, this is a letter, so it's flowing just like a letter. So chapter 9 piggybacks onto chapter 8 and goes right along with what he already had mentioned in what we saw in chapter 8. So here we are, chapter number 9, beginning in verse number 1. Paul says, for as touching the ministering to the saints, and he's talking about that collection for the church in Jerusalem, as touching the ministering to the saints, it is superfluous for me to write to you. Well, the word superfluous means unnecessary. So what he's saying here is, I just got through talking to you about that collection for the poor of the church in Jerusalem. And he said, I realize it's kind of unnecessary for me to say anything more about this, but as most preachers do, he says, I know it's unnecessary for me to say anything about this, but I'm going to go ahead and say another word or two about it. And so here's his doing his impression of a Baptist preacher. Verse 2, for I know the forwardness of your mind, for which I boast of you to them of Macedonia, that Achaia was ready a year ago, and your zeal hath provoked very many. He said, I know that you intended a year ago to give that offering for the needy there at the church in Jerusalem, your brothers and sisters in Christ, and I've boasted to those in the churches up in Macedonia that have already given. I boasted to them about your desire to give a year ago when I was with you. He says, I boast to them of Macedonia that Achaia was ready a year ago. Achaia is the name for the southern part of the Greek peninsula. And Achaia is what was just south of the city of Corinth, but Corinth was considered part of Achaia. So when he says Achaia, he's talking about the city of Corinth and any other churches that might have been there at the time down in the very southern part of Greece. He said, and your zeal hath provoked very many. Apparently when Paul was there at the churches in Macedonia in the north, he said, listen, those down in Achaia, those in Corinth, they've already said they're planning on giving to this love offering for those that are in need in Jerusalem. Would you all like to give too? And he says the zeal of them hearing about your zeal for wanting to give caused them to want to give. He said, so now it's been about a year, but you haven't given your part of the collection yet, even though I bragged on you that you said you wanted to. So you can see where Paul's going with this, that they've said they wanted to participate in the love offering, but they haven't yet followed through with it. And I suppose that's probably because, at least to some degree, because of the yan and the problems that were going on in the church at Corinth, where someone was trying to stir things up, keep the pot stirred there in the church at Corinth, and they just hadn't gotten around to giving yet. So he says here in verse number 3, "Yet have I sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain in this behalf, that as I said, ye may be ready." So he's talking about whoever he's sending with this letter that we know is 2 Corinthians. He's saying, I'm sending the brethren with this letter to you, and so you go ahead and be ready to give when we get there, so that we won't get down there and you still not be ready to give. He says, verse 4, "Lest haply if they of Macedonia come with me and find you unprepared, that we say not ye, should be ashamed in this same confident boasting." He said, I'm sending this letter to you so you can go ahead and get your offering prepared, get it ready, because when I come, if I have some of the Macedonians with me and they come with me and you still don't have a love offering to send, that'll be to my shame. Not yours, but to mine, because I boasted about you. Verse 5, "Therefore I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren." Exhort means to encourage, to get motivated. "I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren, that they would go before unto you and make up beforehand your bounty." He says that's why he's sending those with this letter to go on before him and help them, stir them up, get them enthusiastic about their giving, "whereof ye had notice before, that the same might be ready as a matter of bounty, and not as of covetousness." Well, covetousness is wanting something that belongs to somebody else. I think what Paul is saying here is, listen, I want you all to go ahead and get your love offering ready, so that when I come, if I bring some of the Macedonians with me, I don't want you to start giving just because they gave. I want you to go ahead and get your own love offering ready, so that when we get there, it's already prepared. He's calling it a bounty, but he's talking about this love offering. Now, if you look over here at the whiteboard, before we proceed any further, I put two words on the board: tithing and offering. There are two types of giving in the New Testament church, and I want to just briefly distinguish between the two, what they are. Tithing is where we give a tenth back to God of all that He has given to us. Now, tithing, of course, was ordered under the Mosaic law in the Old Testament, the law they got at Mount Sinai. And there are some people who say today, well, in the New Testament, even though we're told to give, the New Testament doesn't specifically, explicitly use the word tithing. It doesn't tell us we have to tithe in the church today under the New Testament like they did under the Old Testament. And some people, they say, well, I don't have to give 10%. That's a tithe, and that was under the law, and we're not under the law today. Well, let's try to clarify this. It is true that the command to tithe was under the Mosaic law, and we are not under the Mosaic law. Absolutely correct. But tithing did not start under the Mosaic law. Tithing was already being practiced in the Old Testament for believers way before Moses was ever born. In fact, if you remember back to the story of Abraham, Abraham tithed hundreds of years before Moses was born. Anybody remember? To whom did Abraham pay his tithes?
I can't think of the name of it. It was the king, Melchizedek.
Yep, that's right. Melchizedek. Very good. TR, is that what you were going to say too? The king of Salem, that's right. So So Abraham tithed to the priest of God, Melchizedek, and he did that 400 years before the law was given to Moses at Mount Sinai. So tithing was not something that started under the Mosaic law. Believers all the way back to Abraham were tithing. And if I could challenge our thinking, the reality is tithing started all the way back to Adam and Eve and their family. Because if you remember what Cain got so angry with Abel about, was that God told him to offer a sacrifice, and what they were offering a sacrifice was the best of what they had. And God told them, God had shown them how to offer an animal sacrifice for their sins. They were using what they had and giving it back to God. And so in that sense, they were already giving back to God of what they had all the way back to Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. And then all the way through the centuries after that to Abraham, he was still tithing. Under the Mosaic law, God made it part of the law that the children of Israel were to tithe. And so those who live today in the church age, since we're not under the law anymore, those who say, well, we don't have to tithe. We just give whatever we want to give. Well, I think that's true. We can give whatever we want to give, but it ought not ever be less than what they were giving under the law. Because the book of Hebrews, as we saw just a few months ago when we went through the book of Hebrews, chapter by chapter, verse by verse, the theme of the book of Hebrews is that the covenant we're under now is what kind of covenant? A better covenant. So if what God has given to us is a better covenant, why would we give God less under the better covenant than what they gave to God under the lesser covenant? And so, yes, it's true that the word tithing is not specifically mentioned in the New Testament as a command to us, but believers have been tithing all the way back to Adam and Eve. And so for Christians today to act like we don't have the same obligation today to at least give back to the Lord a tenth of what we have is just stealing from God. That's really what it is. Miss Mary?
Didn't they tithe even their, when they, not only tithing that kind, they tithed, like when they canned stuff and one thing, another, like that, back then?
I'm not sure what you might be thinking of, Miss Mary. There were different kinds of sacrifices they could make to the Lord, so it might have been one of the different sacrifices you're thinking of.
Right.
But they had, under the Mosaic law, they had a tithe, and they also had something known as a temple tax that was started in the book of Exodus under the law too. The tithing went to pay the Levites, who were the priests of Israel under the Old Covenant. The temple tax was an annual tax, a once a year tax that all men in Israel over the age of 21 paid once a year, and that money went for the upkeep of the tabernacle and later the temple. The temple tax was the equivalent of about 2 days' wages. So in today's U.S. dollar terms, that would have been somewhere between $200 and $400 was the temple tax per man that went for the upkeep of the tabernacle and later the temple. So in the New Testament church, we all should at least give what believers have been giving all the way back to Adam and Eve, which is a tenth. The tithes at Pinnacle Baptist Church are used for the upkeep of the ministry right here at Pinnacle Baptist Church. Beyond the tithe, there is something which Paul is asking them to give here, which is not part of their tithing. It's an offering. It's in addition to their tithing. It's a free will love offering. You can participate if you want to, but you're not commanded to participate. The offering that Paul is asking them to give toward here was for the other believers at the church in Jerusalem who were being persecuted and were in the middle of a famine. Some of the offerings that we give to here at Pinnacle Baptist Church, we sometimes take up love offerings for specific people and specific needs. We also take up an offering for missionaries, and that's how we support our missionaries that are on the field, is through faith promise love offerings for missionaries. And so an offering is in addition to the tithe. It's not a command, it's just something we do in addition, over and above our tithing, if we choose to. The offering Paul is asking them to give here is not part of their tithe. It is not commanded by God. It's a free will love offering, but they had already told Paul that they wanted to participate. They intended to participate. Had they not already told Paul they intended to participate, he might not be so adamant that you should follow through with your commitment if they hadn't already said it. That's right. They had already said they were going to. So verse number 6, Paul continues and says, "But this I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly. And he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully." Now, of course, there are some of those preachers that preach the prosperity gospel, that if you give to God, you'll get back tenfold, or you'll get back sevenfold, or whatever. That's what that preacher up in Decatur preaches, that flies around in those 2 Lear jets, whichever one he decides to fly in this week. The prosperity gospel is not what Paul is preaching here. What Paul is preaching, though, is that if you are faithful to God, God will be faithful back to you. He says that if you sow sparingly, you'll reap sparingly. Now, in terms of agriculture, that's certainly the truth, because if you only throw a few seeds out there, why, there's only a possibility of a few plants growing up from that. If you throw a bunch of seed out there, why, you've got the possibility of a bunch of plants coming up. And so what Paul is talking about here, he's talking about sowing and reaping. I don't think he's necessarily talking about the financial aspects of it, though. He's talking about the spiritual sowing and reaping. That if you give to the Lord bountifully, you can expect the Lord to give back to you bountifully. That is not necessarily always going to be in financial terms. It's not like the prosperity gospel preacher's message, but that if we're faithful to God and we're trying to bless others that are doing the work of God, the ministry of God, then you have every right to believe God's going to bless you for trying to be a blessing and a help to them in the ministry of the gospel and getting the gospel out. Verse number 7, "Every man, according as he hath purposeth in his heart, so let him give. Not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver." Yeah, I mean, this is the principle that is applicable to this right here on the board, a love offering. It's not your tithing. It's not a command from God. He plainly says, not of necessity. He says, you're doing this because you've decided in your own heart that this is what you ought to give, this is what you want to give. And so if you do this, do it solely because you want to do it. And he even goes so far to say that God loveth the cheerful giver. He says, don't give it grudgingly. So in other words, if you're giving this just because you think that I'm going to scold you if you don't, he said, don't give at all if that's the case. Unless you're giving because you want to give, don't give. Because let's face it, does God need my money? No. God doesn't need my money. God's program was going on well before I ever came along. It's already His anyway. That's right. And so if you give because you want to give with a cheerful spirit. And if you don't have the right kind of spirit, Paul said, don't give it all, because God doesn't need your money. God's going to go on with or without you. You're the one who'll be missing the blessing, not God. Verse number 8, and God is able to make all grace abound toward you. That is, God's able to take care of you, that ye, remember that's you all, that ye always, having all sufficiency in all things, may abound to every good work. Again, Paul's just saying that God is able to take care of whatever your needs are. Verse number 9, I take that as an amen back there. Verse number 9, in parentheses, as it is written. Okay, so what is that telling us? He's fixing to quote the Old Testament scriptures. As it is written, He hath dispersed abroad. He hath given to the poor. His righteousness remaineth forever. Now he that ministereth seed to the sower, both minister bread for your food, and multiply your seed sown, and increase the fruits of your righteousness. Let me ask you a question. Who is it that gave to you? Who is it that gave you whatever you have? God did. And so God has given to us so that we in turn can give to others and give back to God. And that, as the Apostle Paul is saying, if He ministers bread for us, for our food, and gives us some that we can give back too. That's what Paul is expressing here in verses 9 and 10. God has given you so that you can give. Verse 11, being enriched in everything to all bountifulness, which causeth through us thanksgiving to God. Paul said, God has given to you everything you need so that you can give. And so that when you give, then we, that's Paul speaking for Paul and Luke and Timothy and Titus, so that we can give thanks to God for you and for your giving. But he's saying, he's making sure they realize that all of it flows from God. God gave to you so that you can give back. And so you can give to others that are saved. I'll say this again. I mentioned it a couple of weeks ago in chapter 8. There is no instance in the New Testament where Christians are either commanded or expected to give to lost people. The church is not commanded to go do the Lions Club, the Elk Club, the Moose Club thing and just give to willy-nilly to whoever needs money or wants money or has their hand out. But Christians are taking care of Christians is what we see here in this passage. All right, so continuing on in verse 12, for the administration of this service not only supplieth the want of the saints, but is abundant also by many thanksgivings unto God. Whilst by the experiment of this ministration they glorify God for your professed subjection unto the gospel of Christ, and for your liberal distribution unto them and to all men, and this is one long sentence continuing, and by their prayer for you, which long after you for the exceeding grace of God in you. And so what Paul is saying here is that the giving here of this gift, he calls it the administration or the ministration. He's talking about this giving for this particular cause, the cause of the poor saints in Jerusalem that were being persecuted. He said the administration of this is not only to supply for them, but it's also so that we can give thanks for your giving. It's good for them, but it's also good for you who are giving. You're getting something out of this too by being the ones doing the giving. What is it that a Christian gets out of giving? What does a Christian get out of giving? What do you think?
Warm, fuzzy feeling on the inside.
All right, Josh says a warm, fuzzy feeling. We're looking for something more than the warm, fuzzy feeling. Lawrence?
Fruit.
What kind of fruit?
Fruit that you bear from giving.
Okay, we're bearing fruit as we're supposed to. Miss Mary, you were going to say something?
I said love.
Love, there you go. Christian charity. Anybody else? All of those I think are accurate. Even the warm fuzzy feeling maybe.
I guess that I was going to say on there where it was saying that them giving to the poor or whoever was needing it would also increase those people's thankfulness to God.
There you go. I think Alex is right. I think that's part of what Paul is saying here. You giving to help them in their need, it's going to increase their thankfulness to God. Because they didn't know where it was going to come from. But you supplied their need. God supplied it through you.
They saw that we had it and then they
And
saw
then it
that
was
we
given.
had it, and then
That-
uh,
I think you're right, Mary. They saw that these believers had it, but gave it for them, for their benefit. And so what Alex is saying is right. So they give even more thanks to God. So it all flows from God, but it allows all of us, both those that are giving and those that are receiving the gift, to have a part in giving thanks back to God. And then the last verse of the chapter says, "Thanks be unto God for His unspeakable gift." That unspeakable gift is, of course, that He takes care of us. He's our Father, and He's the one that provides anything and everything we have need of. He is our sustenance, is what Paul is saying here. All right, so chapter number 9 kind of tied in with chapter 8. It kind of finished out, rounded out that part about giving. Chapter number 10 now, Paul is going to shift his comments back to that ongoing part of the book of 2 Corinthians where he's had to be dealing with whoever it was in the church who has been saying untoward things about Paul while Paul was gone, which is a very cowardly way to do it, by the way. Wait till he's gone to say bad things about him. But apparently that's what this person was doing, trying to stir things up, maybe more than one person. Paul's going to take what he's just said about the grace of God and thankfulness and giving, and he's going to kind of wrap that up and tie that back to that original message he started with whoever this was that was stirring things up. And so let's see how he does that. And the Apostle Paul is just an amazing, he's very good at using the spoken word, and in this case the written word, but also using just logic in helping people to see how things relate to each other. So look what he says in chapter 10, beginning in verse 1. "Now I, Paul, myself," so he's making a personal appeal to them, "I beseech you," which means to beg, "by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am base among you, but being absent am bold toward you." So what he's saying here is, I'm begging you, me, Paul, the one you know, I'm personally begging you. And he says, when I was with you in person, I did not try to exalt myself. I was just base. I was just simple. I was just one of you, is what he was saying. In presence, I just made myself like one of you. But in my absence, and now that I'm writing to you and I'm not there with you, Paul says, I'm very bold to say what needs to be said. Now, I don't think that the reason Paul wasn't bold when he was there with them, it's not because he was afraid to be bold with them. It's because he didn't need to be bold with them, because they were listening to what he was saying and being obedient to the Lord without him having to be bold. He didn't have to get in the pulpit, in other words, and pound on the pulpit to get their attention when he was there with them. They listened to him. They wanted to listen to him because they saw and felt his heart. They knew he loved them and wanted God's best for them. He didn't have to be bold in the presence. But because they've kind of strayed away a little bit, he's had to be bold with them in writing this letter. but still because he loved them. But he said in verse 2, "But I beseech you," or I beg you, "that I may not be bold when I am present with that confidence, wherewith I think to be bold against some, which think of us as if we walked according to the flesh." Paul says, I'm begging you, make sure that when I get there, whatever needs to get fixed is already fixed before I get there, so that when I get there, I don't have to be bold in person the way I'm being bold in this letter. Because, he says, because I am inclined to be very bold when I get there towards some of you. I think that's, if I could put this in terms of when I was a kid growing up, that would be kind of like my mama calling my daddy while he's at work because we're misbehaving and saying, Tom, when you get home, you're going to have to deal with something because these two boys are misbehaving and not minding me. And I can just see my mama handing the phone to me and my brother and say, your daddy wants to talk to you for a minute. And this happened on at least one occasion that I can recall, TR. And I didn't want to take the phone, but I knew I better take the phone. Yes, sir. And my daddy saying, now, this is what your mama said. This is what better happen. Otherwise, when I get home, this is what's going to happen. I kind of think that's exactly what the Apostle Paul just said to the church at Corinth. And if I were one of those Christians there at the church of Corinth, knowing this is the Apostle Paul, I think the response he's hoping for is they're going to say, you know what, folks, let's get this taken care of before the Apostle Paul gets here. Verse 3, for though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. Now he finished verse 2 by saying that there are some of you that think we walk according to the flesh. He's hearkening back to what he's already said. There are some of you there that are spreading this stirring the pot stuff by saying that the Apostle Paul is just out for what he can get for himself. He's just making merchandise of us. And Paul says here, I'm not doing what I'm doing. I'm not walking according to the flesh. I'm not telling you to do what I'm telling you to do because I'm trying to get an advantage over you or take advantage of you. I'm not doing that. He said, we, that is Paul and those with him, we do not walk in the flesh. We do not war after the flesh. He says in verse 4, for the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. That means of the flesh. But mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. Boy, if you're a Christian that has anything in your Christian life that you can't seem to get a hold of, you're always having defeat after defeat in your Christian life because of something in your life, verse 4 is a verse you ought to memorize. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. It is not anything in my flesh that's going to help me overcome whatever I'm battling, if it's spiritual. But mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. A stronghold is one of those big towers, those big fortified towers made out of stone like you would see on the corner of a castle. And Paul says that the power of God is able to pull down those strong towers. Lawrence?
Let go, let God.
Let go and let God. Okay, there you go. He's saying God is able to take care of these spiritual things. Paul says we're not trying to fight this battle in the flesh. We're depending on God. We're trusting the Spirit. Verse 5, he says, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. Do you know that In your Christian life, there is no sin that you've ever committed that didn't first run through your head before you did it. Sins don't happen by accident. Sins are intentional. You know, it's just like with the law today. Brother Ned, if I'm correct, intent of breaking the law is something they have to prove in court, that you intended to break the law. You didn't just accidentally break the law. You intended to break the law. And if they prove that to a jury of your peers, you're going to be convicted of whatever the crime is. Well, what Paul is saying here is that we need to bring into captivity every thought of our minds. Because this is where the battle is won. Now, I'm saying in the minds, but the heart is synonymous with the mind spiritually. It's where decisions are made. And so what Paul is saying is that every bit of our thoughts, our imaginations, it all has to be brought into captivity, into obedience to Christ. If you're having a problem with one or another sins in your life, the solution is to bring your mind and your heart, in whatever area that is, into captivity to Christ. The way we bring it into captivity to Christ is by bringing it into obedience to Christ. And I think the reality is that most Christians who are losing a particular battle in their life spiritually over and over is because they've never brought that, whatever it is, into captivity, into obedience to God. When that comes up in their mind and in their heart, they're giving into the flesh and allowing themselves to think about, dwell upon, and then do whatever it is, instead of warring against it, battling against it, bringing themselves into obedience to God. Preacher, does that mean that a Christian can be totally without sin if they did this just like they're supposed to do all the time? I'm not saying that. I don't think any of us are going to be without sin until we see Jesus face to face in our glorified body. But we ought to be warring against the flesh, not just letting it have what it wants to have. Every time it wants something, we just give into it. But that's what American Christians do too often, and that's why American Christians are so anemic spiritually, is because we just give in to whatever our flesh wants anytime it wants something. I think that's why the church or churches in America today are in the shape that they're in, because we're not used to saying no to ourselves about anything. After all, we're Americans. We give ourselves whatever we want. Most of the time we can buy it, and if we can't buy it, we'll just allow ourselves to indulge in it and pay for it later. That's what Americans do, right? And so we've trained ourselves spiritually the same way. And so Paul says the battle is won in the mind and in the heart, bringing ourselves into those thoughts into captivity and bringing ourselves into obedience to Christ. Verse 6, and having in a readiness to revenge all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. Do ye look on things after the outward appearance? If any man trust to himself that he is Christ's, let him of himself think this again, that as he is Christ's, even so are we Christ's. Now, verse 6 and 7, Paul is saying that there are, I think, some there in the church at Corinth who say, when they look at themselves, well, I'm Christ's. And Paul says, but when you look at us, you don't think that we think that of ourselves. we think something different. And Paul says, we are of Christ just like you are of Christ. Verse 8, for though I should boast somewhat more of our authority, which the Lord hath given us for edification, and not for your destruction, I should not be ashamed. Now, Paul had authority. He had authority not just as a preacher of the gospel, but he had authority as an apostle. And the authority of an apostle was a greater authority than anybody at the church at Corinth had. It was even greater authority than the pastor at the church of Corinth had, because Paul was one of the apostles. He's one of the 12. And so Paul, being an apostle, he has the authority. He said the authority, though, is for edification. That is to build you up. It's not to tear you down. He says, not for your destruction. He said, I have the authority, he's talking about those with him, but he's really talking about himself. We have the authority to build you, but it's for the purpose of building you up, not tearing you down. He said, I should not be ashamed. He said, I have the authority to tell you what to do. Don't put me in a situation where I have to tell you what to do, but I have the authority to tell you what to do, is what he's saying. Verse 9, that I may not seem as if I would terrify you by letters. I think Paul's saying, don't make me have to get ugly here, but if I have to tell you what to do, I'm going to tell you what to do. But don't make me have to do that. For his letters, say they, are weighty and powerful. And he's saying that those back in Corinth talking bad about him say, Paul's letters are weighty, they're real powerful letters, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech contemptible. Whoever this was at the church in Corinth that was causing these internal strife and problems, they were saying, yeah, Paul's a real big man when all he's doing is writing letters and sending letters by hand delivery through somebody else. But when he's here, he's not so big and bold and brash.
But they won't say that when it gets there.
Yeah. Yeah, I bet they weren't going to say that when he got back if the problem still wasn't fixed. Paul is trying to express to them, listen, the reason I wasn't that way with you when I was there is because I didn't have to be. I didn't need to be. But when I come back, if that's the way I need to be, that's the way I'm going to be. Look at verse 11. Let such an one think this, that such as we are in word by letters when we are absent, such will we be also indeed when we are present. He said, if you think I'm not bold when I'm present, just wait until I get there. Verse 12, for we dare not make ourselves of the number, or compare ourselves with some that commend themselves, but they, measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise. Preacher, what is Paul saying here? He's saying that there are some people who like to compare themselves to other people, maybe even other Christians, to show how spiritual they are. You ever known any Christians that did that? I have. He said to try to show you how spiritual they are, they compare themselves to each other. They compare themselves to others in the church. But wait a minute, as Christians, are you my standard I'm supposed to compare myself with? No. Who am I supposed to be comparing myself to? Christ, that's right, the Lord. And so Paul says, those are unwise people who are comparing themselves with each other instead of to the standard we're supposed to be comparing ourselves, which is Christ. He says they're very unwise. He says not wise. Verse 13, but we, Paul says, we will not boast of things without our measure, without being measured, in other words, but according to the measure of the rule which God hath distributed to us, a measure to reach even unto you. Paul is saying, we're not going to view ourselves as having any more authority than what God says, I have authority to tell you to do. And of course, he's speaking as an apostle. So whatever authority these people might have thought they had, whatever spiritual greatness they might have thought they had, none of them were apostles. None of them could have claimed they had authority above Paul. That's the argument of logic he's making here. Verse 14, for we stretch not ourselves beyond our measure. In other words, we're not trying to make ourselves out to be more than we are, as though we reached not unto you. For we are come as far as to you also in preaching the gospel of Christ. Paul says, everything we've done is for you. It's to reach you with the gospel. Not boasting of things without our measure, that is, of other men's labors, but having hope, when your faith is increased, that we shall be enlarged by you according to our rule abundantly, to preach the gospel in the regions beyond you, and not to boast in another man's line of things, other man's line of things made ready to our hand. Paul said, we're not boasting about what other people have done. We're not trying to take credit for what anybody else has done. We've done what we've done to reach you with the gospel. And that when your faith is increased, it will open a door for you and us together as a team to reach beyond where you are, to reach other regions with the gospel also. Not taking credit for what anybody else has done, but that's what we've been trying to do ourselves. We put ourselves into it. And you and I together will go beyond this to reach others. Verse 17, but he that glorieth, let him glory in the Lord. Well, there it is. For all those hypocrites, for all those who think they're better than anybody else, there it is right there. He that glorieth, let him glory in the Lord. Whatever it is you think you ought to have a right to brag about, give the credit to God. That's what he says here. Don't be taking credit yourself. Give the glory to God. By the way, that's true of an individual. It's also true for a church. What great things God has done, let's don't take credit for it ourselves. Let's give God the glory. And then the last verse, verse 18, for not he that commendeth himself is approved, but whom the Lord commendeth. Now, commendeth means giving yourself a pat on the back. He says it's not the one that pats himself on the back that has God's stamp of approval. It's the one that God pats on the back and says, well done, thou good and faithful servant. So what Paul is saying here is, listen, we're not trying to take credit for what anybody else has done. We're not trying to use you for our gain. We've poured ourselves out for your good. That when you give yourselves to the Lord, you and us together might go beyond that and reach others, beyond your region, with the gospel of the Lord Jesus. This is a very personal appeal Paul is making here in chapter number 10. And though he's speaking of himself, you and I would do well to take the things the Apostle Paul says he tries to live by, and us try to live by them too. There's a lot of good advice, both for what Paul does, by example, and what he recommends that the church at Corinth do. We ought to follow those pieces of advice too. Well, We got through both chapter 9 and 10 tonight, still in good time. Anybody have any question or comment about anything we've talked about tonight? All right. Josh, would you take us to the Lord and ask Him to dismiss us tonight, please?